all together. Good morning, everyone. I'm Ellen Bruno. I'm an assistant cooperative extension specialist at UC Berkeley, and this is some joint work with Katrina Gesso at UC Davis and Michael Hanneman at Arizona State. And we're looking at the impacts of taxing groundwater use over time. Okay, so in theory, we make the distinction between short run and long run, where, in the short run, we take certain factors to production as fixed, and then we think over the long run, those become choices. But empirically, this distinction can be harder to make. Oftentimes, econometric studies rely on short run variation because that can often help overcome identification challenges. But things to respond to a certain policy, firms have several margins of adjustment. Some of those can take time. And so perhaps the short run estimates aren't capturing all the long run margins of response. And so the risk with using the short run estimates, you can overcome some identification challenges, but then maybe risk mischaracterizing sort of the full economic cost if you're not capturing these long run margins of adjustment. So we're going to investigate these dynamics in the context of agricultural groundwater, which is a setting that's characterized by lots of externalities. Groundwater often features a lot of the issues with common pool resources because property rights are not well defined. It's often unregulated, and as a result, we see externalities on both quantity and quality. Farmers increase the pumping costs to their neighbors, reduce the stock of the externality in the future, degrade water quality, and there's a big and growing body of literature. These are just a couple of papers that address elements of characterizing these externalities in groundwater use. So in response to the externalities, economists often prescribe pricing the externality. We could set a tax that's equal to the social marginal cost, such that we internalize the externalities and reach the sufficient level of extraction. And this is it's long been proposed even for groundwater. But agricultural groundwater is typically not priced. It's typically not even metered, yet it's 80% of consumptive use of water. And so that's a pretty big deal. And taxing groundwater could have really meaningful effects, but we have very little experience with prices in practice to really know what the impacts of those taxes would be and whether or not long run dynamics are important for setting a policy target or setting a tax to reach a certain policy target. In our setting, we're looking specifically in California, and this is particularly policy relevant given the ongoing implementation of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, which is requiring basins throughout the state to achieve groundwater sustainability by 2040. And gives these basins a lot of flexibility in how they want to comply with the policy, and setting taxes on groundwater is one tool in their toolkit, and it's something that is being suggested as a potential policy by several of these agencies currently. So our paper is going to look at the effect of a volumetric groundwater price on agricultural water use and try to look at these dynamics over time. We're looking specifically in one irrigation district that happens to not only meter their groundwater, which is very rare, but also price their groundwater. And so we're gonna, in this region, for several years, farmers were all experiencing the same uniform volumetric price for groundwater. And then sort of halfway through our sample, we see this split in groundwater prices that's geographically based, where a subset of farmers are then begin receiving a much higher price than everyone else. And so this was a result of a lawsuit, and we're going to exploit this legal ruling in our empirical setting to try to see the impact of this price increase on water use. And so we have quarterly groundwater extraction from the 900 wells in this irrigation district over a period of 10 years. And what we find is that the shift in the pricing regime that led to a pretty large and permanent price increase for a subset of farmers had a significant impact on reducing the groundwater extraction, and that effect doubled from year 1 to year 5, implying that the dynamics in the price response are important and relevant for setting policy related to groundwater extraction. So, you know, as I sort of alluded to with the motivation, trying to understand the long run dynamics of the price response is pretty challenging. There's a growing body of evidence addressing the short run response to agricultural water prices. A lot of this literature, you know, has relied on electricity prices combined with the depth of the aquifer to try to estimate what the cost of pumping is, because prices, you know, rarely exist. And so that's, I think we'll see some of the work in this space and how in improvements for trying to better characterize those pumping costs. And then there are a few studies in like a handful of small places where there is groundwater pricing and metering. But oftentimes these are panel data approaches that rely on short run variation in prices and are not really designed to capture longer run decisions. But we know that, you know, when farmers are responding to increases in water prices, you know, it could be just on the intensive margin, reducing water use per acre of a given crop, but there are also other ways in which they might respond, such as on land use margins and adjusting what crops they're growing. And these aren't behaviors that we think can occur overnight, but rather take time. And so those dynamics might be relevant here. Yeah. So we're focusing specifically on the Pajaro Valley on California's Central Coast. It's an area that grows a lot of high value crops. It's known for berries and vegetable row crops. And it's off the state water project grid. And so they just rely on groundwater. But because the agency, this region is located on the coast and that they've been relying on groundwater historically, they've suffered from saltwater intrusion issues from overdraft of the groundwater. And as a result, the water agency there, who's managing the groundwater resources for agriculture in the region, has done a lot of different projects and things in order to reduce these saltwater intrusion problems. And so the agency has actually been charging a volumetric price for groundwater since 1994 as a means to generate revenues to fund its basin management activities. And the primary concern in this region is these salinity issues. And so the agency has instituted this tax on groundwater to generate revenues to fund a recycled water program where they take water from the city of Watsonville, treat it, and distribute it to certain farmers on the coast where the displacement of their pumping would have the greatest benefit to the basin. So this is the region, you know, the blue outlines the irrigation district we're looking at, and each black dot is a groundwater well for which we observe extraction. And this highlighted purple area close to the ocean is what's called the delivered water zone. And that's the region that receives recycled water from the agency in order to offset some of their groundwater pumping. This region was created because the recycled water is a very limited supply. It changes from year to year, but it's somewhere between 3% and 10% of total basin water use. And so because they couldn't produce enough of the recycled water to come close to offsetting how much groundwater pumping is happening, they established this limited region for folks who were eligible to receive it and others weren't. And so we end up getting this nice price variation because, you know, everyone was paying the same price for groundwater, but only a subset of pumpers were receiving recycled water. Somebody outside that zone sued in violation of Prop 218. And it resulted in this price split. So At the end of 2010, we see this split where the agency was raising rates for everybody, but those inside the delivered water zone received a price increase that was 21% greater than those outside the delivered water zone. And yeah, this relates to Prop 218, which requires that parcels that are taxed on a tax related to land must receive services that are in proportion to the tax that they receive. Okay, thanks. And okay, so yeah, this is the variation that we're going to use. You know, we have these two zones and pre-treatment, post-treatment. The setting lends itself nicely to a simple difference in differences framework. I'm going to start by presenting average treatment effects and then present event study design to show how those change over time. So sort of the simple diff and diff framework inside treatment zone times post period after that price split at the end of 2010. And we include farm and county year fixed effects. You know, identification relies on that parallel trends assumption that I'll show some evidence for later when I present the event study design. But regardless of that, there's still concern about, you know, regional time varying observables, particularly given what we know about the recycled water program and groundwater quality issues. Those are factors that might be varying with the region over time that we might be concerned about. And so we're able to do some robustness checks by conditioning on those factors directly, recycled water, salinity, and the depth to the groundwater table, and show robustness of our estimates to that. So here are the average treatment effects of the price increase on water use. First showing the simplest diff and diff, and then we introduce parcel fixed effects and then the county year fixed effects in column 3. And we're seeing a pretty large and significant reduction in water use that's really stable across the 3 specifications. And then just really quickly, I'll show the sort of robustness to the additional control variables that I mentioned: recycled water, groundwater, salinity, and depth to the water table. This is on the using the quarterly data because we had some gaps in the data. Okay, but moving on to the more interesting dynamic effects, we're going to do an event study framework where we have 3 periods pre-treatment and 5 after, and we're going to normalize everything to 2009, which is our most recent year before treatment. So here are the results from the event study looking at annual water use. First, I want to just point out if we just look in the pre-treatment period, we don't see any differences between the inside in water use between the inside and outside zone relative that are statistically different from their difference in 2009, which sheds some light on the parallel trends assumption. But after the introduction of the price increase, we do start to see a decline in water use that varies and grows from year 1 to year 5, where in year 1, we're seeing impacts of negative an 18 acre foot reduction that doubles by year 5. We can look again this time, thank you, just honing in on summertime water use instead of the annual aggregate water use. And we see a similar story where, again, we don't see any pre-treatment differences, but then in the post period, we see this reduction that is pretty stable for the first couple of years and then declines more in 2015. So overall, we're seeing that this permanent and large price increase caused a significant reduction in agricultural groundwater use. And we're seeing some evidence that the dynamics in that response over time could be important, because in the annual event study, we're seeing a doubling in input use from year 1 to year 5. And so that obviously has implications for setting the optimal tax to reach a certain policy target. if you were to use those estimates from year one, you might understate how much groundwater extraction would actually occur relative to those, in comparison with those year 5 estimates. So yeah, that's what I have. Thank you so much.
How do you deal with the effect in the error chain of your regression in terms of the dynamic story? Maybe people when you're faced with these new effects, maybe they change, they make decisions about crop, which crop to grow, and that would imply that the error curve is not, standard white noise. What would be the implication in terms of the econometrics?
So are you suggesting like we need to control for the crop choice somehow? I mean,
Maybe.
because yeah, it's tricky because the crops that are being grown are also a choice that the individual farmer makes. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes, but that would be important, right, for your story, for your dynamic story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we have some land use data, and we've also looked at that in response to see how crop choice is changing in response to the price increase. And we have seen effects on switching crop mix in response to the price increase. So yeah, we definitely think that that's a part of the story. Yeah. I just didn't show the land use results. Yeah.
So what happens here 4 and 5? Because there seems to be a trend, or even an increasing trend, well, decreasing because increasing in absolute value. And then at year 5, that's when like it's moving up. So like, what would you explain that? Because it's not like a trend that's going like steadily making a bigger difference between the two groups. It's just a drop in year 5.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to make sense of them as well. I don't have a good explanation for, each year to year adjustment, why it's happening that way. Yeah.
Do they have access to surface water as well? And just like wondering if there's a reduction in groundwater use, maybe they're like leaching.
Yeah, this region is like disconnected from surface water sources. And so the only alternative source is the recycled water that the agency provides. And we have data on those deliveries, and it is it's a sort of quantity constrained situation. So we've controlled on that and seen that the results are pretty insensitive to the inclusion of recycled water. Yeah. The town of Watsonville is in this irrigation district, so it's urban wastewater that gets treated and distributed to farmers. So that's part of why there isn't very much of it, because it's costly to do that. Yeah. Thank you.
So how do we do this again?
Is it a PDF?
It's HTML.
So yeah, I think it should be fine because you're already switching.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I'm gonna discuss the paper a little quick. It was really great and the paper, and it was really fascinating. I do some work on this field, and it was really interesting. And I really like the clean identification strategy that we cannot afford to have. All right. So the finding, I was surprised with this finding. It was so because of the 20% increase in water price, so 90% water reduction in groundwater is observed, and so irrigation cost is pumping cost plus water price, right? And the farmers are responding to irrigation cost, and the pumping cost. I took this number from a table, and the pumping cost average is about 150 dollars per acre feet, and water price is about 180, over the years. so basically 20% increase in water price is roughly 10% increase in irrigation costs. And this is such a stark contrast to the previous papers that found price elasticity estimates of like 0.2 to 0.5. So I was really surprised that you found the such a big effect. But this is kind of consistent with Smith et al., which also find a fairly large price elasticity estimates. So I'm going to compare recent empirical papers that use more traditional approaches. So the most of the studies were on Midwest. So they're growing corn and wheat and soybean, and so the price papers that had low price elasticity estimates, they were looking at low value crops, and they are also only looking at basically short run impacts. So your paper and also Smith's paper, you're kind of, so don't worry about it, this 1 year, 4 years thing, but you're kind of, when you do DID and 5-year average, you're looking at the mix of short run and long run impact. And you're also looking at higher value crops. So, there's some differences that may explain why there's such a big difference in price elasticity estimates. But the fact that you were looking at higher value crops, so I thought because of that, you should be having a even lower price elasticity estimate. So I was pretty surprised. And looking at the methods though, so Smith 2017 and your paper, you have a really clean price variation that you are exploiting. But the previous papers, we had to impute the cost, and there's a problem omitting values. I did some work on this, and I feel like the previous papers that look at more traditional approaches, they might be severely underestimating price elasticity estimate. Because of the fact that the two studies that use the clean identification strategy, you're finding much higher price elasticity estimates. Okay. All right. So I have a little suggestion. So this has something to do with the fact the fourth year impact is a little bit lower compared to fifth year, and so when you do event studies, it's really important that you control for variables with temporal variations that can be substantially different between the treated and control group year to year. So basically precipitation and evapotranspiration. So this is a different area, but it's kind of similar in setting. But this is Lima in Kansas. If you have read the Drisdale and Hendricks, they use this similar DID strategy, and this is looking at the precipitation over the years in the treated and control. And as you can see, there's some divergences in precipitation, and this failure to control for precipitation explicitly may sort of bias the result, and it's particularly severe if you're doing event study because you're looking at 1 year. If you have 5 years, then it's kind of average out as long as it's random. But if you're looking at one particular year, you could have large difference in precipitation. So that may have caused the some sort of instability across years. But looking at the map that you have, it's kind of such a tiny area, and you are including county year fixed effect. So I'm not sure if this is the cause. I thought I thought you were looking at the much larger area, but if you're looking at how small the area is, you may not have this problem at all. Okay. Right. I think it's time. I have a little bit more. Oh, I can send you the slides. Yeah, but this is what I have.
So if I was understanding, you're certainly surprised by the size of the.
Oh yeah. It's really large, and yeah, if farmers are that responsive, it's really nice. For us, trying to conserve water.
Ellen's looking at sort of longer run impacts of the price on we would expect that the elasticity would be larger.
Yeah. for sure. So that's why I did that little comparison. You know, the previous studies, you know, they are looking at just short run, but even then, the difference is very, very high. So that's what surprised me.
And the panel is only 5 years, so like averaging, like I agree with you, the magnitude are really quite large. Like 5 years isn't that much time,
Yeah.
so averaging over that still having a big effect. Yeah, thank you so much for this point.
Good. Oh, wait, you're.
I think some work that you highlighted looking at issues regarding the pump cost calculation. And that can have an impact on the elasticity estimates as well. Now, I want to make sure I caught that right. I mean, Smith et al. Was doing it a little differently than.
Yeah, they have a similar design with the DID design where they have a, like a tax, like $45, and then later it was increased to $75 or something like that. They were doing the similar DID design. So this paper and Smith, they have this very clean, much cleaner identification.
Okay, so the Smith et al. And Allen as well, they're both picking actual pumping costs rather than using engineering formulas.
Right, and also what's important is that it's independent of the other factors that could be affecting pumping costs, because one of my papers show that the pumping costs and the value are correlated between each other because of the when the saturated thickness goes down, the value goes down as well, and the value is such an important determinant. So meaning value can affect the price elasticity estimate. But when you do DID, this kind of natural experiment, you don't have to worry about it, right? I mean, you're independently changing the water price, but you're basically fixing the value. I mean, values are not going to change, that rapidly, over like 10 years. So they have much more cleaner identification.
Any other questions?
So you are defining for me short run and long run is about margins of adjustment other than the amount of time. So in terms of the margins of adjustment, you mentioned the costs. What are the longer adjustments that you're doing?
So we're also, I mean, we have some land use data, so we could try to explore land fallowing or retirement and crop choice. Those are the things we can observe. There are other adjustments farmers could make for those only. Just the land use data and water use data, that's all we can observe. But yeah, and so there's the question of is 5 years long run? Like, can we really call it that? Because it sounds short, but at the same time, we do see changes in the land use within that time period. So if if we're seeing changes in crop choice and land value in that time run, then maybe it can be called. I think it's fair to.
Just a suggestion about controlling the other. So if you try estimating the average business effect by comparing with one action, you actually try to like the outlier kind of, would you still need to explicitly control the other? Or
Yeah,
is
it's
that
fair, because progressive matching is on the path. What you're worried about is what's going to happen after the treatment. So even if you control or even if you match, I mean, you have a greater chance of having similar weather after the treatment, but it doesn't hurt. I mean, it doesn't hurt to control exclusively for rainfall.
Hey, sorry, for the loud beeps, I can't control those. We'll move on to the next presentation, which is mine, and Mani will be my discussant here. I believe this is displaying properly. I'm not sure about the Zoom part, but we'll proceed. All right, so hi, good morning. I'm Kent Kovacs, and I'm a research agricultural economist at the Economic Research Service. So groundwater is crucial to agricultural systems. There's a general lack of studies on the monetary value of groundwater, though, which makes it difficult to assess the human impacts of groundwater use. The value of groundwater in storage is particularly difficult to measure because there is no market. Their mineral rights such as oil, natural gas, gold, these have markets, but subsurface water is not considered a mineral right. So environmental change such as the climate or even changes in human capital, such as the years of formal education of farmers, or changes in social capital such as the irrigation practices in use by farmers, friends, and family, can all shift the demand for groundwater. And we can learn something about the substitution and the complementarity of groundwater with other forms of capital based upon those shifts in the demand for groundwater. So empirical measurement rather than just assumption of the relationship between natural capital and other forms of capital matters for the debate, the sustainability debate on how we maintain our social welfare as we deplete our natural resources, right? So that's the other thing we're looking at here. And the approach to answer these questions is the hedonic property value method using a two-stage approach. So most applications of the hedonic property value method stop with the point estimates from marginal willingness to pay. But Rosen in his classic paper suggested that these implicit prices from the hedonic property value method could then be used as a dependent variable and then matched with in our case, a quantity of in situ groundwater and some demand shifters to then, with proper application, then estimate a demand equation for groundwater. And so this is an aim of the welfare analysis in most cases is to do an evaluation of non-marginal changes in the value of an environmental good. So in this case, that's what we're trying to do. So the study area for this paper is the Mississippi River Valley Alluvial Aquifer. It's a primary irrigation source for the Mississippi Delta region. The largest user of this alluvial aquifer is Arkansas. More than half of those withdrawals are overdraft. So these overdrafts then represent losses of the value of agricultural land. And these losses are expected to intensify as the climate becomes hotter and drier. So estimation of the first stage hedonic model is through a generalized linear model with a log-link function to avoid the bias and OLS estimate of a log linear model. We're testing for an appropriate functional form here by starting with the box Cox and then finding statistically that the log linear had the best fit. We allow for a non-linear marginal value of groundwater through a cubic form of saturated thickness and define a dummy variable of irrigation using if there's an irrigation well on the parcel. Excuse me. So we control for time varying factors such as precipitation, number of growing degree days, proximity to wells and reservoirs, on-farm reservoirs. These can all vary over our time frame of, so our data goes from early 90s to, I believe, 2020. So it's a 20-year period of panel, or excuse me, not panel, but 20-year period. And so we also control for time invariant factors such as commute times to population centers, soil characteristics, proximity to streams as well. We're accounting for spatial unobservables, through spatial fixed effects. And so we start with no spatial fixed effects and go all the way to county subdivision spatial fixed effects to try and show that those do matter. And then we're dealing with potential time varying unobservables as well, using quarter by year dummies interacted with critical groundwater areas to control for things like commodity price movements or water management rule changes. So we recover through the second stage then, the inverse demand equation for groundwater to go beyond this point estimates of the marginal noise to pay from the first stage. Identification problems, though, arise because the buyers of the land are choosing simultaneously both the quantity of groundwater that they desire from the agricultural land as well as the price that they're going to pay for that water. And so we use two sources of identifying power to address the expected bias and the demand slope estimate through the nonlinearity of the price gradient, hence the cubic function of the saturated thickness, and then also the use of multiple markets. So even with those approaches, we still expect there to be identification issues. So we use two sets of instruments. One borrows from the literature on residential sorting. So we use an instrument that takes a value of 1 if we're in a county subdivision with the lowest saturated thickness, value of 2, but so the next lowest saturated thickness, and so on, as one sort of an instrument, sorting instrument. And then we also use more classic recommendations of instruments in this situation with demand shifters interacted with the market dummy as well. Use those two, suggested by well, I guess by Rosen and then by Bartik in the 80s. So. All right, so let's jump over to the results here. And so I mentioned before that these spatial fixed effects have a role, and you can see as you increase the number of the spatial fixed effects, that ultimately we lead to a statistically significant value of groundwater, but it's only when the saturated thickness is at a low enough level that it's 80 feet. So the average saturated thickness of the study area is 110 feet. So in this case, our estimates are saying that an additional acre foot of groundwater in that case really isn't doing much for agricultural land value. So it's really only after it's significantly depleted that's having an effect. And it seems like it's around $9 when you've got 80, for an additional acre foot when it's 80 foot saturated thickness. All right, so we need these multiple markets to be able to estimate this demand equation for the groundwater. So we're using sort of a mid-south land values lease trend report to try and find areas with similar management rules and soil characteristics to try and delineate these markets. And so then we estimate the that's not displaying as well as I'd like, but we're then estimate each of these first stage hedonic models for each market separately. And we see that there is quite a bit of heterogeneity at play here, where markets 1 and 2, we have statistically significant values for an extra acre foot of groundwater that are much above 9. So $78 for market 1, 23 for market 3. But the other markets, it's not significant at all. Right? All right, so then we're taking those implicit prices and from the different markets, and we're using and then we're using them as dependent variables and to estimate properly our demand equation using generalized method of moments. And so we've got then the estimates of demand. What we're seeing here are coefficient estimates of the demand shifters, right? So that was sort of the second main research question we were trying to answer, is what are empirically measured the size of these demand shifters. And so I'm going to highlight the ones for education, for example, just paying attention to the sign there, it's negative. So this is saying that as education increases, this is going to shift in the demand equation for groundwater. So suggesting that education and groundwater are substitutes for each other. When we're talking about different ways to measure the role of potentially social capital, and so that's these variables that have the big pier in front of them there. And so it's whether they've got a pier that uses these different irrigation techniques. So common ones in the area include measuring groundwater flow through flow meters. Less common but increasing is alternate wetting and drying for rice production, and then tailwater recovery systems. So when it seems to be these older technologies such as flow meters or tailwater recovery systems, they're recycling groundwater or measuring groundwater, then it seems like these techniques are complements to groundwater use. Whereas if it's a newer technology, it seems like they're substitutes. We do throw up a map here showing graphically what kind of value we can expect if there's a rise in 10 feet of saturated thickness. So that's trying to illustrate the importance of using a demand equation for a non-marginal change in groundwater. So in this case, a 10 feet increase in saturated thickness. And we can see that, you know, it's spatially dependent upon where groundwater is already well depleted. So if it's heavily depleted already, then you're going to have the biggest rise in agricultural land value there. So then to wrap up here, we're looking at point estimates, marginal willingness to pay here, and it's statistically significant, around $10, which is comparable to some other places around the country, though a little bit lower. I think it's it's actually comparable to the Ogallala aquifer. It's lower than what I've seen in California using a property value studies. But yeah, and then we're using the demand equation to get a change in property value for a 20-foot change in saturated thickness. So if we're looking at the average land in the area, that's about $148 bump in agricultural land value. But that depends quite a bit on what kind of farmer you're talking about. So if we're talking about farmers that are more educated and are using techniques that are newer, then a rise in saturated thickness isn't as valuable. So it's more like $43. But if you're talking about farmers that are already heavily dependent on groundwater, don't have other options readily available to them, or they're just dependent on tailwater recovery systems, then certainly that rise in saturated thickness is more valuable to them. And it seems like it could be as valuable as $228 to agricultural land. Anyway, so yeah, so I think that takes me to the end. Are there any questions? Yeah.
Since you show that spatial fixed effects are really important, do you have enough repeat sales that you could actually go finer and include like a parcel level fixed effect and then just identify off of the repeat sales? Yes,
that's a great question, and we had tried a repeat sales estimation. The trouble with the repeat sales is it really, and it gave us a sample that was different. So than the one with the, without that uses the larger set of all transactions in the area. Yeah, so that was the big concern. I mean, I think that a number of other studies have applied the repeat sales using the Donna property value method, and they find that it tends to increase the marginal value of groundwater. And we were finding that when we tried this repeat sales method as well. So that was sort of reassuring that we saw that was consistent, but it was just, then we did summary statistics based on just the repeat sales sample, and it just seemed too different from the whole sample as well for them to be very great.
I guess you could apply these spatial fixed effects methods to that subsample that just have repeated sales to get a sense for how, whether it is the change in subsample or the change in fixed effect.
Okay, yeah, right. That's a good point. Yeah, yeah, that makes sense.
Curious, just how many transaction numbers you have in that period?
Yes. Yeah. So the number of observations, shucks, should put that up there. It's It's not a lot, you're right. I mean, it's over a 20-year period, still a pretty thin sample. I think it's, I want to say 2,000, but maybe it's got to be, I think it's even more than that. But yeah, but that could be ballpark where it is. Yeah, you're right. You're right. There's not a lot of these land transactions that happen. So.
You would normally limit the zoning analysis. Right, instead, that increase the number of observations, and that's problematic. I'm just thinking that.
I mean, yeah, we steered clear of the assessed values, thinking those wouldn't be arm's length transactions or they wouldn't represent, but yeah, that's something we haven't looked at yet that we could try. I mean, I guess my impression is a lot of the assessed values depend upon the impressions of can be a bit different from county to county in terms of the assessor and not necessarily reflective of the market itself, but. Okay.
Right. So I'm Mani Ruhirat. I'm an assistant professor at Texas A&M discussing this paper by Kovacs. Overall, I really enjoyed reading that paper. I think both looking at the title of the paper and as I was thinking through the paper, I was thinking the main contribution will be mostly towards the relationship between natural capital and other forms of capital. That there are really two questions here in terms of one, in terms of the hedonic part of it, but the other part about the relationship between natural capital of groundwater and other forms of capital. And I think the relationship between natural capital and other forms of capital, like produced capital, human capital, and social capital, is really at the heart of this sustainability debate as we think about weak sustainability and strong sustainability. What is substitutable? What is perfect substitute and what is not substitutable at all? And what we are seeing recently as we are doing more empirical, more rigorous empirical work at these, is that these are really empirical relationships that we cannot rely on ex ante just based on the economic theory to just assume that things are necessarily perfect substitutes, that as we deplete natural resources, we can always replace them with human ingenuity necessarily in every situation. And that certain relationships cannot be assumed ex ante when we think about these type of relationships. And a lot of times they're empirical questions and that we need to think about the details of that empirical question as well. From one situation to another, there may be substitutes and in some situations there may be complements. And some of that result is also presented in this paper as well that I really like. The other thing that I really like is that the relationship between natural capital and human capital, and especially natural capital and social capital, finding examples of these are very rare overall. How changes in depletion in natural capital, for example, affect investment in different types of capital, but especially in human capital, in health, education, or in terms of social capital and how they are related to natural capital. So there are very nice questions that are being asked in that part of the paper here that I really enjoyed reading. I think one suggestion here about the social capital is just to be more specific that this is the social capital here because the focus is on the peer effects here rather than, even though there's an irrigation technology there, the technology question is there in terms of the produced capital, but just calling that the social capital just to be consistent across the paper, I think that would just help clarify things. And this is some detail in the paper. I think in the theory part, as I was reading the theory part of the paper as well, that I think because these are early steps that we are taking in understanding the relationship between natural capital and other forms of capital. It's very important to highlight some of these differences and these situations where substitution or complementarity may arise. We'll lay them out more clearly in the theoretical section so that we know, like, in which situation we would expect substitution, in which situations we would expect complementarity. For example, you mentioned that the non-production value of groundwater, the property rights that may be very different. In the case, for example, that we studied in the case of Panama Canal, the property rights situation is very different than the case of groundwater, where it's a shared resource. How will that affect the relationship between natural capital and human capital, for example, here? And you mentioned in the paper that the substitution changes to complementarity relationship that I think from the draft paper, if I remember correctly, this is a limiting argument that because of the subsistence requirements that this substitution converts to complementarity. But that is probably not the case in the case where we have a lot of saturated thickness still left in the aquifer. Why these substitution relationships convert to complementarity relationships, and what is the driver of these differences between these type of relationships? So laying that out in terms of the theoretical sections will probably help for the reader thinking what to make of the empirical results, and also just putting it out for the future, like studies that will come out of the relationship between natural and other forms of capital. And also thinking about the differences between short run and long run here. One argument that we made there in that paper was that in the case of other forms of capital, market forces always result in supply of more capital. So if you think about the market for produced capital, the price signals will result in an increase in the production of produced capital. But in the case of natural capital, we are always in the short run in terms of the margins of adjustment. There is no market that says, okay, I will immediately provide more groundwater, for example, in the aquifer. Nature doesn't respond to price signals in that sense. We are always in the short run. So making some of those differences is also important here. And one other thing that I think more on the empirical side is that a very nice thing in this paper is that you have a lot of cross-sectional variation here, and that is something that we were missing in the natural capital paper that we did. We only had one Panama Canal in that case, and we were thinking it would be very nice to have multiple canals with different variations. And this is the nice thing here, that you have a lot of cross-sectional variation in that sense. But at the same time, the exogenous change in investment in the form of capital is missing here. So that's one difference here in terms of having the cross-sectional variation, but also not having the explicit investment in form of natural capital or human capital in this case, whether an investment in human capital affects the shadow price of natural capital or not. And in this case, what is being exploited here is that the cross-sectional differences across the respondents in the second stage in terms of their education level, for example. So that makes me think a little bit about whether there is some omitted variable bias here in the case of these educational and peer networks that may be correlated with some other factors that may be correlated with education and peer networks, and also the shadow price of natural capital in the second stage. The other thing these are maybe a little bit more detailed, but in terms of the multiple testing of the multiple intercepts, whether these shifters of the second stage, they're being tested at the same time for the second stage regression. So maybe confidence intervals need to be adjusted for that. As I think one of the questions discussed that more in terms of more local dummy variables, especially when it comes to that second stage, whether there are things that are correlated for more educated folks that are correlated in terms of, at least spatially, in terms of where they look at and the saturated thickness levels and the prices in a specific region. And the other thing, maybe the interaction between, so the slopes may be different. Not only the shifters may be different, but also the slopes of the second stage may be different as well. And then there's a policy argument here that in the policy side, it is, I'll get to that policy side at the end of it. But Yeah, so in the policy side, one thing that I was wondering about is that one of the ways that we discuss reducing groundwater use is through more educational type of policies. And here it sounds like education results in a reduction in the shadow price of natural capital. And then how that will affect the demand for natural capital in terms of the users. If price of natural capital is lower, whether that will increase the demand for groundwater in the flow space, not in the capital space. How will that be the result of the policy? So a policy that will incentivize an investment in education can result in an increase in groundwater use among the producers, which may be the counterintuitive or unintended consequence of the opposite result that the policymakers may expect, because then that will reduce the shadow price of natural capital for the people who have more education. But overall, I think that the relationship between human capital in terms of education and natural capital is very interesting in a way that it substitutes, confirms some of the earlier theoretical expectations that economists have, that as we deplete natural resources, our innovations will replace this natural capital and reduces the value of the natural capital. But better understanding what are the mechanisms, why do we see some of those differences, exploring some of that in the paper will be very helpful. You have a lot of surveys for the second stage. I think exploring some of that, of how these differences, what is driving that differences between education and shadow price of natural capital will also be very helpful. Thank you.
I think in the interest of time, we should probably head on to our next presenter, but I've got not too soon to those slides.
Sure. Awesome.
All right. See, and we're still sharing, I think. Okay, great. So I'm Matt Warman. I'm a assistant professor at UMass Amherst. This work is co-authored with Aaron Rosenzik, Fiona Berlig, and Louis Prionis, and we're looking at how agricultural producers here in California use groundwater as a form of adaptation to the hot and arid climate that those producers experience here. And so the motivation for this work is that for nearly 30 years now, there's been this rich economics literature looking at the effect of climate or temperature shocks on agricultural productivity. And it's maybe one of the more familiar kind of takeaways from this literature is this result from Schlenker and Roberts' 2009 PNAS paper, where they're looking at the effect of temperature exposure to corn yields in the eastern United States. And what they find is that temperature is not a big deal up to about 28 degrees Celsius, but beyond that, it starts to have really detrimental effects on corn yields at the extreme. 24 hours of exposure to about 40 degrees Celsius can reduce yields by something like 7 or 8%, which is huge. But what is kind of less well known from this paper of theirs is that this effect actually varies a lot regionally. So this is the effect for the eastern United States, and I'm going to show that again here on the right. If we look at the western United States, the effects are much more muted. Those extreme days of 40 degrees Celsius only affect corn yields by a couple percentage points. And so there's this big regional heterogeneity in the effect of temperature on agricultural productivity. Of course, there's a lot of things that are different between the East and the West US, but one big difference is that irrigation is a lot more prevalent in the West, and agronomy suggests that irrigation can provide kind of a buffer against these really extreme temperatures and a way to adapt to these hotter and more arid climates. That's kind of what we know in theory. In practice, though, empirically identifying any kind of climate adaptation behavior tends to be really challenging. Oftentimes we observe these longer run outcomes like yields, but we don't actually observe things like day-to-day behaviors that we could identify as adaptation.
But what we're going to do in this paper is tackle this question head on. How do agricultural producers adapt to these higher temperatures? Our research design is going to be to leverage a novel data set that we've constructed on pump level groundwater extraction in California's agricultural sector. And we're going to use that to empirically identify this one important form of climate adaptation behavior. There might be others, but we're going to look at this one, how groundwater pumping responds to temperature shocks. And just to give you a quick preview of the results, we're going to find that each hot day increases annual groundwater pumping by as much as 3.5% at a cost of $400. We can also dig into some daily effects and see what's happening kind of on a day-to-day level and find some interesting results there that I'll talk about over the next few slides here. But to just take a quick step back and look at the kind of the setting that we're looking at, like I said, we're looking at California. It relies on groundwater irrigation a lot. California agriculture produces about $45 billion in gross revenues, which is about 17% of total US crop value. So you can think of agriculture as being important in California, but also California agriculture just being an important part of US agriculture. And this is in spite of the fact that this is occurring in these really arid climates. So we have a map here of precipitation in California. Much of the production occurs in the Central Valley, which is also the area where there's essentially no rain. So they're growing these really high value crops in areas where they get no water kind of naturally. What that means is that nearly 8 million acres are irrigated, and over 50% of that is irrigated through groundwater. And so it's this critical input. Some areas have access to only groundwater, like the Pajaro Valley that Ellen was looking at. There are some areas that have access to surface water through the California Water Project, but they still rely heavily on groundwater as kind of their backup or their marginal source of water. Historically, this groundwater has been open access. So if you own some land, you can drill a well and then pull the water up, but that is changing because of Sigma. And so, looking 20 years into the future, hopefully we'll be able to achieve some sustainability, and that could, of course, change the way that these responses look. But another important aspect of this groundwater pumping in California is that nearly all groundwater pumps are powered by electricity. And that's what we're going to leverage to construct our data set here. And really the fact that groundwater extraction is just governed by physics. The amount of groundwater that you get out of a pump is a function of the amount of electricity that goes in, how efficient that pump is at converting the electrical power into mechanical power, and then how far out of the ground that water has to be pulled. And so if we observe all three of those things on the right-hand side here, we can get groundwater that's coming out of the pump, even though we don't directly observe it. So what we're going to use in this paper is electricity data from PG&E. That's the electric utility for the northern part of California, including a majority of the Central Valley, where a lot of those high-value crops are grown. We're also going to have pump audit data from a PG&E program that performs pump audits, and so we see for a subset of the pumps in California, we see these rich characteristics that include those things that we need, like operating pump efficiency, how deep the well is to get lift, those kind of things. We also have groundwater data from California Department of Water Resources, so we can see over space and over time how deep the water is that farmers are pumping. We go into a lot more detail on exactly how we do all this calculation in kind of a companion paper that is a working paper. So if you want to see all the gory details, we have like a 30-page appendix with all the details there. So you can go take a look at that if you're curious. In addition to this, though, we're going to take these groundwater pumping data and combine them with weather data. In this case, we're using the gridded PRISM weather data. So at a 4-kilometer grid, we can observe daily max and min temperatures as well as daily precipitation. And so we're going to take all of our pumps where we observe all these rich characteristics, match them to daily temperatures. And what we end up with is a sample of over 10,000 pumps for the years 2008 to 2019. In this figure here on the left, we're just plotting where all of our pumps are located. Every dot in that figure is one of our pumps. So you can see we've got pretty good coverage, especially throughout the Central Valley there. And the color of those dots corresponds to the average daily maximum temperature in the month of July. So another thing you can see is that it's pretty common for these farms in the Central Valley to be hitting 36, 37, 38 degrees pretty regularly throughout July. So they're just getting hammered by hot days after hot days throughout the summer. So those are the data we're using. Let's look at what we're actually going to do empirically. We're going to do a few different empirical specifications. I hope I have time to get through them all, but we're going to start with an annual regression that looks a lot like that kind of Schlenker and Roberts figure that I showed you. It's just that on the left-hand side, we are going to put pump outcomes. How much groundwater are these pumps extracting, and what is the cost of that extraction? So we're going to put that on the left-hand side. We'll have this flexible function of temperature and precipitation on the right-hand side. Then we'll have both pump fixed effects and annual fixed effects to take care of any time invariant cross-sectional variation or any kind of common shocks that are hitting all producers at the same time. And so I'm going to show you a series of figures here to show the results. Across the x-axis, we have maximum daily temperature in degrees Celsius. And on the y-axis in this figure, we have the inverse hyperbolic sign of water consumption. The inverse hyperbolic sign is like a log. So you can kind of think about this as like log points or percentages. And so what we find is this positive sloping relationship between the temperature that a farm is exposed to on a particular day and how much water is being pumped, how much groundwater is being pumped. At the extreme here of 40 degrees Celsius or more, these agricultural producers are increasing their pumping by as much as 3.5%. Let me say that again, just to make sure I'm saying it clearly. 1 day of exposure to 40 degrees Celsius is increasing their annual pumping by 3.5%. Keep in mind that when a heat wave comes through, they're going to be getting hit by many of these 40-degree days, and each one of those is going to increase annual pumping by 3.5%. So it really starts to add up when you get multiple hot days in a row here. So, this is kind of our first takeaway, that temperatures cause producers to pump more water, and we might also be interested in what the cost of that adaptation is. We can use our electricity data to just see what's the electricity cost of running these pumps. And what we find is, once again, this positive relationship. Every hot day is increasing the cost of operating these groundwater pumps. And at the extreme here, we're talking about as much as $400 a day. One single really hot day can increase pumping costs by as much as $400. Once again, to the extent that multiple hot days might be coming together, those costs can really start to add up as well. One thing that's nice about the data we have is we don't have to just rely on these annual outcomes, though. We have in our electricity data daily and even hourly pumping. And so we can look at a kind of a more refined level to see what's happening kind of specifically on the hot days themselves. So we're going to run a similar regression here where our outcome is groundwater pumping just on one single day. And so we're going to see how is groundwater pumping changing on a hot day itself. In this case, we're going to include pump by month of year fixed effects. So we're going to take out not just cross-sectional variation, but also kind of seasonality that might exist at the pump level. And then we're also going to include week of sample fixed effects. So we can take out a really kind of refined measure of any kind of market level shocks that are happening. And once again, we see this positive relationship. The kind of shape is a little different, but it is this positive relationship. As agricultural producers experience hotter temperatures, they're pumping more on that day itself. In this case, we see this kind of interesting relationship where it kind of flattened off once we hit about 32 degrees Celsius or so. But what that means is that once temperatures are up there above 32 Celsius, agricultural producers are increasing their pumping by 7, 8, 9%, something like that on the hot day itself. Interestingly, we find that this adaptive behavior kind of occurs through a couple of different margins. One is the intensive margin. Producers that would have been pumping anyway pump more because it's hot. And then also some producers who would not have been pumping on a more moderate temperature begin pumping because it's hot. So we see both kinds of responses that you might expect. One of the things that's I think kind of cool here is we can, because of our daily data, we can look beyond just the hot day itself and think about the fact might do things in anticipation of hot days and also after hot days. So it's not just that they're going to wake up one day, see it's hot and turn their pump on. Then they might know a few days in advance that a hot day is coming and start to take these kind of protective, adaptive behaviors in advance of that hot day. So the last thing we're going to do here is a regression that's similar to the previous one I showed you. But instead of just including contemporaneous temperature on the right-hand side, we're going to include 7 days worth of lags and 7 days worth of leads in temperature. So we can trace out not just what happens on the hot day itself, but what's happening the week before a hot day and the week after a hot day. We're going to include those same fixed effects to take care of any kind of pump level seasonality that you might worry about, or common shocks to the entire market. And here's what we find. It's a little confusing, so let me talk you through it. The darkest line here represents being exposed to temperatures of 36 degrees Celsius or more. All the way on the left-hand side here, this is what a producer is doing 7 days in advance of that hot day, 6 days, 5 days, 4 days, all the way up to the hot day itself, and then after. And so what we're seeing is starting about 5 days before that hot day, the producer is increasing their pumping. And every day subsequent, they're increasing more and more. They actually peak the day before the hot day, not on the hot day itself. And then they start reducing their pumping, reducing from that peak kind of day over day until about a week after they're back to their the normal level of pumping that they would be doing if they hadn't experienced that temperature exposure. We see similar effect. Really, it's above about 30 degrees that we're finding this kind of really large effect, lower amounts of pumping at more moderate temperatures. But this is showing that there really are these kind of more nuanced and complex ways that these producers are engaging in this adaptive behavior. It's not just well, it's going to be hot today. Let me go, turn the crank. So just to recap. Prior work has suggested that irrigation is this important form of adaptive behavior, but it's been really hard to kind of empirically pin down or identify that this is happening and to what extent it's happening. So what we've done here is construct this novel data set of daily pump level groundwater extraction and used it to identify this important form of climate adaptation behavior. And just to recap our results, we find that agricultural producers are in fact engaging in irrigation to kind of provide a buffer against these hot temperatures. Each hot day is increasing annual pumping by 3.5% at a cost of $400. So we think of that as kind of our willingness to pay for this adaptive behavior, $400 a day. We also can see that pumping is happening on a hot day itself. And that's coming through multiple margins, intensive and extensive, but also that there is this kind of more complex behavior, this inverted U shape that I showed, where they're kind of ramping up their pumping before and then continuing to pump after that hot day is actually passed. So that's all I've got. Thank you so much. Look forward to questions and comments. Yeah, Owen.
I have two sort of related questions. First, I was just curious about heterogeneity in the response
Yep.
of the groundwater pumping the temperature,
Mhm.
and if you thought about, or if it's possible to use CDL to see how it varies by crop type, just because I was curious, and then sort of follow up to that, wondering if your results have any implications for what we think of as growing degree days and partial degree days in California, or for irrigated areas, and building off of that Wolfram Schenker work.
Yeah. So, okay, so for the first one, yeah, we've looked at a lot of heterogeneity. I didn't include any of those slides here. And to be honest, I can't probably characterize it exactly. We have looked by crop type, and I know there are differences depending on what you're growing. I can't remember offhand exactly what that is. We've also looked at heterogeneity by surface water availability. So looking at the white areas that don't have any surface water versus the areas that are part of a water district, and also looking in drought years versus non-drought years when the amount of surface water allocations would be different. I know we find differences, but I can't remember exactly what they are. So I can get you that stuff offline. In terms of Yeah, heating, harmful degree days. Yeah, what could, I mean, I guess we could, the kind of Schlenker and Roberts results are inclusive of any of this adaptive behavior. And so I guess we could think about how much pumping do we actually observe in response to those hot temperatures, and maybe there's some way that we could use like agronomic models to back out what would have happened in the absence of that amount of pumping or something like that. Yeah, maybe we can talk more though about what exactly you had in mind.
Yeah,
thinking
no, I'm
about
not
that
even
stuff.
sure if my question makes sense.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, Mon.
So in terms of the irrigation technology, just what it is, I'm just thinking it's probably not centrifugal, but for something like centrifugal, you have to turn it on and to rotate around the field. How much flexibility that is in terms of the irrigation system to turn it on and off. In terms of the actual effects of the increasing or reducing irrigation to the spot, do you have something like the fields to see how it will affect the final outputs?
So on the first point, I think there's little center pivot in California, especially in the orchards. That's going to tend to be irrigation. Surprisingly, I think there are some areas that still use flood irrigation for rice and things like that. But yeah, I think there certainly are limits to the ability to adapt, since it is just like you turn it on and let it run. We find, that because of our data, we can see not just how much is being pumped, but like how many hours is the pump actually turned on for. And so we can see that, in fact, the mechanism for this additional pumping is just that they let their pumps run for longer. Yeah, that might have different implications in a center pivot world, though, where it doesn't make sense to just let some portion get a little extra water, but not the whole field. What was your second question again?
The effects on yield.
The effects on yields. Yeah, so one thing that we're doing now is to try to replicate those Schlenker and Roberts figures using kind of just our study area. So once again, I mean, that's going to be the effect of temperature on yield inclusive of this adaptive behavior. What we would really be interested in is if we could somehow ask some farmers to not do the adaptive behavior and see what would happen there. I'm guessing we can't actually ever make that happen, so we kind of would have to impute what that effect is. Yeah.
Just about this point, you can find there's like a formula by the FAO that will give you what would happen if you did not. So if there's a response to water deficiency, it's called the 10-minute equation. I think you can use that, and it will give you what would happen if you did not irrigate.
Yeah.
We have this much efficiency, so we could get that difference between, without having to ask a farmer to not irrigate into the crop. You can get that relationship.
Yeah, so we could use our estimates of how much extra water is being applied and then back out what effect that might have on yields. Yeah, that would be interesting to do and see if that actually reconciles that difference between the east and the west. Okay.
So in terms of the cost of pumping, do you have that data as a direct measure?
Yeah, so we observe the electricity bills. So that to the extent that these pumps run, it's more than 90% of pumps in California run off of electricity. And they tend to be that there's a meter attached to a pump, and that's all that meter is picking up. And so we see those bills. So
the other source of heterogeneity would be the level of groundwater.
Yes.
They will have different costs.
Yep.
So maybe there will be a difference between farmers who are on areas where the head is higher than the other areas.
Yeah. So there are a few different ways that kind of relationship between electricity and groundwater can vary. One is the depth, obviously. Another one is just how efficient your pump is. So, if you have a really bad pump, you're going to waste a lot of electricity, kind of in the same way that you have to use a lot of electricity to pump it from really low. So we have looked at heterogeneity across those dimensions as well. And interesting, what we find is that the water consumption is actually roughly similar across, quartiles basically of how good a pump is at converting electricity into water. But what that means is that the places where either the water is really low or the pumps are really efficient, they're having to use a lot more extra electricity to get that amount
I
of
would
water.
say that's what the survey will give you differences between, like, some people are gonna have a higher willingness to pay because their costs are gonna be higher than other farmers, and they are
Yes.
still willing to pay like more than the 400 average.
Yeah.
It's still very big.
Yeah, so the 400, I said it's a willingness to pay, it's really a lower bound on the willingness to pay.
So I have a question about the specification.
Yeah, yeah.
You talked about having a flexible function.
Uh-huh.
Specification. What are those?
Yeah, so we just, so like in this one, for example, in the daily one, we just take maximum daily temperature and bin it up into 2-degree bins. So this would just be like, is the maximum temperature between 38 and 40 degrees on this day? And so then we estimate a different parameter for each of those bins. So kind of flexibly trace out that relationship. I know Kent has comments, so I don't know if we should give him time to do that.
Well, I think, we're running up to our end of our session, so maybe I'll throw up my slides here.
But I'm happy to stick around and chat with folks after this. There's still other questions.
All right, I'll just want to make sure Matt has all the feedback he can get here. Okay, I really like this paper, rich data set, and can answer some pressing, interesting questions with it. So just by way of the summary here, he saw noted that if you had a 1 day, where you had greater than 40 degrees Celsius, then that could increase groundwater pumping by 3.5%. And then for each day where temperature was above 32 degrees Celsius, then that meant that you would increase pumping by 7 to 9%. And this happened through an intensive and extensive margin. So what he meant by that was this is more pumping by farmers that were already planning on pumping. They do more, they pump more. And those that weren't planning to pump would decide to turn on the pump when you had a day that was hotter than 32 degrees. And he noted that, that there's a lead and a lag in pumping associated with the hot day as well. And in particular, the peak happened the day before the hottest day. And the increase in pumping that was largest was the day before that hot day. All right, so some comments on this translation between electricity and groundwater. So you made note that most of the pumps are electric and that there wasn't any variable frequency pumps. And so that would have changed the calculation if there were more variable frequency pumps. So good you're being aware of that. I guess it seemed like the groundwater depth data was pretty good, but I mean, it's monitored by the well. I guess I would just, I guess I come from working in a study area where the groundwater depth data isn't quite as detailed and robust. And so that, you know, getting that data, you know, very, because I guess I'd be concerned that you know, you can have these very small cones of depression around wells that could lead to water depths that are very heterogeneous and might not reflect the actual the depth anyway. So that was a potential concern. At least it would be in, you know, the Mississippi Delta region, maybe not as much in California. Concerned about the pumping of air, you know, so the well yield of this and the variability associated with that in terms of the electricity and the translation of that to groundwater. So if you've got these, if you have very little lateral conductivity, so very little lateral flows, then you could be pumping air over a certain point in time, you know, expending electricity, but not necessarily producing, you know, groundwater. So I don't know. Yeah, there was a question about flexible functions of temperature and precipitation. That that was very nice. That was a nice element to the paper. It looked like you had these weekly fixed effects for seasonality. I was wondering why in the annual specification you were doing where you were looking at that 1 day of temperature above 40 degrees. Why not look at seasonality there? Maybe I missed something. Why have just an annual fixed effects? There could be maybe an interaction between, on a monthly basis between maybe some of these precipitation or temperatures as well, and just having, some finer temporal fixed effects. And then I think this is just following up on Ellen's question is, were you trying to tease out differences in pumping behavior between the types of crops that are being grown? I mean, in particular, annual versus perennial crops. I mean, orchards versus, field crops. I mean, is there a difference in behavior that could be really fascinating? Anyway, so that's all I have. So it looks like we're right at our time, but please, if there have been more questions for any of us, I think we'd all. Matt, I'll send you those slides for what they're worth. So yeah.
Thank you for organizing the session.
Yes, thanks so much for participating. It's great papers. Wow. So yeah.
Yeah,